Okay. Well, so this is a bit more of a specific take on the cool water story because it's a kind of a rejoinder. Three people are working on, including me, Stephen Briga, and Stefan Kruse. It's relating to this paper that has been published by Damien Schultz and a couple of co-authors, among them Joseph Henrich, who is a very famous guy. The title is was published in Science, and the title is The Western Church, Intensive Kinship and Global Psychological Variation. And that paper literally went viral. It was commented on in The Guardian, Times Magazine, in the New York Times. So it got a lot of public attention. And what it is focusing on is what Henrich once baptized, so to speak, the weirdness of Western societies. So the argument was that Western societies are very peculiar, so untypical for the remainder of the world. And he invented the term weird in order to signify that specificity or singularities that Western societies share. And weird is an acronym, WEIRD, that stands for Western, educated, individualistic, rich, and democratic. So this is outlined as the features, the typical features of all Western societies, and that Western societies share much more than the rest of the world, particularly the psychological aspects of individualism, to which they add another component in that paper, which they call impersonal pro-sociality. So they make an interesting point here, and I think it's a good qualification of individualism, because sometimes individualism is depicted as egoism or selfishness, which I always thought is wrong, or that that individualism lacks pro-sociality. So they make clear individualism actually does include pro-sociality, because otherwise societies cannot exist, but it's a particular form of it, and they call it impersonal. And that is because Western societies organize solidarity with other people via formal institutions, such as a welfare state, universal healthcare, universal pension schemes that are anonymous. So they do not involve family ties, kinship relations, and that kind of stuff. So they call that impersonal forms of pro-sociality. Individualism also goes together with stronger cooperation with strangers, whereas in more collectivistic society, there is strong group ties, but cooperation and solidarity is limited to the in-group. And in-group, out-group boundaries are much more pronounced and rigid than in individualistic societies. Now, what does the paper claim? The paper claims that all those weird features of Western society originate in the church, especially in the church's marriage policy. And they argue that the Catholic Church introduced early on, let's say around the year 1000, incest, very rigid incest taboos that came with a ban on cousin marriage. And cousin marriage is actually relatively prevalent in other cultural areas, regions of the world. But they argue that because of the church's particular marriage policies, Western societies have early on been detached from kinship as the most important basis of creating social alliances. And kinship was replaced, or ancestry and lineage were replaced by agreement, consent, or contract as the principle of forging social alliances, like involuntary associations, where this is agreement. And this, they argue, produced the individualistic drive in Western societies. And then they show a couple of models, or actually a huge number of models where they try to show that, and their major explanatory variable is what they call the Western Church exposure, which simply measures the amount of years a given population has been exposed to the Western Church. And the Western Church includes the Catholic and the Protestant Church, so both of them, which they juxtapose, of course, to the Eastern Orthodox Church. And then they look at their dependent variables, include measures of individualism, they include measures of outgroup trust, they include measures of kinship ties, they include measures of cooperation with strangers, and other indications of a strong in-group fixation, such as nepotism, corruption, and the like. And they run tons of regression models, and it always turns out that when they look at those dependent variables, the Western Church, their exposure to the Western Church always comes out with a highly significant and usually with the most powerful effect on those variables, even if they are measured today. So that is interesting. So it's a long historic link that they're figuring out here. They also show that historic variables, like historic family patterns, like the early focus in Western societies on a nuclear family, so smaller families that are not multi-generational but two-generational. That also is explained by the Western Church exposure. And one other important finding, they also have a variable for exposure to the Eastern Church, and the Eastern Church exposure does not produce any of these weird effects that we can attribute to the Western Church. They show this on 3 or 4 different fields of evidence. One is countries as the unit of analysis. Then they switch to European NUTS 2 regions, which are the 320 regions into which Eurostat divides up the countries of the European Union. So these are subnational regions, and they have these variables also on that level and show the same effects as on a global scale across countries. And then they also look in the ethnographic atlas of Murdoch and show that the effects also hold for tribal societies. And then again, they look at migrants and where they are coming from and whether their culture is strongly influenced by the church exposure of their sending society. And this is what they find. So very strong effects of the Western Church. Now, style-wise, this kind of argument is not entirely new. It is actually an alternation of Max Weber's much older arguments, although Weber focused more narrowly on the role of Protestantism, the Reformation, and even more so on Calvinism and its particular predestination doctrine. But the type of explanation is similar in that ideological choices of the church back in time explain psychologically prevalent mentality patterns in those populations today. So that is the kind of explanation. You will also find something similar by a book just published by Van Zanden Moore and Carmichael, which is a group of economic historians from Utrecht University in the Netherlands. The book title is Capital Women, and they also look into these historic patterns. And they as well argue that the church is responsible for many of the emancipatory things we find early on in Western societies. This is not to say that Western societies were emancipatory from the beginning, but they embarked on a trajectory where struggles for emancipatory goals became, so to speak, the pulse of Western civilization. These struggles were not always successful, but you find no other civilization in the world for which struggles for emancipatory goals are such an important thing. also in the cultural identity. In our rejoinder, we criticize this paper, both theoretically and empirically. Empirically, we are not convinced that Max Weber-style explanations are entirely satisfactory. Because for one, they are, in a sense, idiosyncratic, because the major explanatory factor is the doctrinal or ideological choice of a given elite that then enforces a certain ideology and policies related to that ideology, and this is not explained. So the main explanatory factor remains a myth in itself, or a mystery, and in that sense, those explanations are not complete because they do not relate back to first causes for which there is no prior. There is also endogeneity problems, because it could as well be that these sort of individualistic, if you want to, egalitarian orientations were already in place since long, and they were the driver why certain ideologies have been chosen, namely because they fit an already existing psychological predisposition. Actually, this argument has been made for Weber's thesis, and Tawney, for instance, has early on argued that Weber got the causal error wrong. Protestantism was successful in areas that already had flourishing capitalism and widespread individualistic orientations, and then the people found appeal in Protestantism's individualism because they already were predisposed to find that an ideology that would fit their own preferences and predispositions. So the causal error would go in the other direction, which is hard to prove, but there is an endogeneity problem. Also, we don't find the argument of Western church exposure plausible for a very simple reason. The weird features, so educated, individualistic, rich, democratic, the societies that are leading here are all in the Protestant part of Europe, whereas the Catholic part in the South is more behind on those kinds of variables, yet has the much longer church exposure, because the Protestant North became Christianized much later, and the Reformation happened much later. And also, the Western family pattern, the nuclear family pattern, is mostly prevalent in the Protestant parts of Europe, and actually not so much in the Catholic parts, at least historically speaking. And that is not fitting very well with their argument, because the Protestant church did not even bother about marriage policies that would ban cousin marriage, because cousin marriage was not prevalent anyways in those areas that were populated by Germanic tribes, basically speaking. So there is a lack of plausibility, and what we do in the paper is to pitch Jared Diamond-like kind of explanation against this Weberian style of explanation. You all know Jared Diamond wrote this famous monograph, Pulitzer Prize recipient, Guns, Germs, and Steel, in which he brings up environmental, ecological arguments why the Neolithic Revolution, so the transition from hunter-gatherer to agriculture, happened first in the area where it happened first. And he had environmental variables explaining this. So we are pursuing a similar explanation, and the principle of that explanation could be phrased like this: environmentally anchored opportunity endowments. These endowments incentivize the enculturation of those psychological orientations that are advantageous to utilize the respective opportunities. Well, this is the kind of explanation that we pursue. So there is environmental conditions, and they always come with challenges and with opportunities, depending on what nature holds there for us. And then we need certain mindsets, certain mind programming to be able to take advantage of those opportunities. And then these orientations become encultured in the population and then transmitted over the generations, provided they are helpful to master life under these environmental circumstances. And then when these, once these psychological predispositions are encultured, we have a mentality structure that then makes certain ideological and institutional choices of elites more likely than others, namely those ones that resonate or fit the psychological predispositions which are environmentally anchored. So that's the logic in our explanation. This type of explanation is also, in a sense, complete because it has a first cause in a longer chain of steps for which there is no prior in time. And that is environmental conditions. They are with us as they are right now. Well, we have climate change today that has accelerated, but we can make a point that the basic environmental conditions that we have since the end of the last ice age are, relatively speaking, constant and not so variable. So in other words, the areas that have been colder or warmer have been colder or warmer already hundreds and maybe thousands of years back in time. However, having that said, I would also emphasize that our explanation is not about determinism, but about incentivation. So certain environmental conditions incentivize certain psychological orientations that then make certain ideological choices and institutional choices by elites, of course, more likely, but not unavoidable. So it's a probabilistic point of view that we are following here. What we argue, or we start from a different point, we, however, favor a very particular environmental configuration, which we call the cool water condition. In brief, this is the combination of two, or it's a certain thermo-hydrological configuration that combines two thermal, so temperature-related elements, and two precipitation or water-related elements. The two temperature-related elements are that in cool water areas, as we define them and as we measure them, we have usually partly or temporarily, but not permanently frozen winters. That's the one element. And the other one is we have relatively cool summers. So we have not a very continental climate where you have very cold winters, but also very hot summers, like in Moscow sometimes. That's a more continental climate. That's not the cool water condition as we measure it. So we measure the combination of modestly cold winters and relatively cool summers. That's the thermal element of the configuration. And the hydro water related one is steady rain throughout all the seasons. So there is no dry season. So continuity of rainfall. And the ubiquity of water reservoirs, whether these are lakes, rivers, or the sea, water is abundant in the cool water areas. So we have also measures of the area of a territory that is covered by water bodies. And we argue that this configuration incentivizes certain psychological orientations, namely productive orientations, which account for the fact that the West was the first civilization to industrialize. And second, emancipatory orientations that focus on freedoms and autonomy, which account for the fact that the West was also the first civilization to democratize. So what creates this incentive structure? For instance, winter cold and summer coolness are thermal challenges that come with a productive incentive for very clear reasons. If you are in cool water areas and it's cold in winter, also cool in summer, you have to spend time producing stuff that protects you from the cold. Very obviously, clothing, shelter. So there is more, is of greater importance for sheltered housing. The housing technology becomes important. Heating technology becomes important. Clothing technology. Then you have to plan for winters where for storage, for food storage, maybe for times when nothing is growing. So this incentivizes work. This incentivizes a disciplined work ethos, so a productive orientation. Also, if you go outdoors and it's cold, you have to stay warm, and that you do through physical activity. So that is also a form of productivity. And much of the time you also spend indoors, and you probably work there as well just to escape boredom, because people didn't have TV and internet and social media or something like that, and they had to do something, not to fall victim of boredom. And so you probably do maintenance or do some craftsmanship or whatever. So this is, the coldness component incentivizes a productive orientation. The water component now makes water, and that's a vital resource, especially in agrarian societies, as everyone will agree. The water component makes water an openly accessible resource. And open access resources diminish, and that is well known in economics. Open access resources diminish the power of elites over people and land. And that means people have certain grassroots autonomies in water access, of course. Everyone has access to water. No one can be deprived from water supply. You cannot monopolize the supply of water in cool water areas. So that creates water autonomy, and from this, derivative autonomies are nourished, like autonomy in work organization, autonomy in family formation, and also autonomy in market access. Medieval peasants had access to markets and could sell their products. The work, as it was organized on a typical family farm that grows rye or wheat or barley and has livestock farming in addition, like feeding cows, they worked very autonomous as a production unit on their land plots. They did not need a lot of collective support. So for all, and this is something, once people have these autonomies, they are fond, they learn to be fond of them, to defend them, to try to retain them and not give them away, which in certain phases can be a break on the process of state formation, because state formation, state building always means the centralization of power, and that usually comes with the curtailment of original freedoms and autonomies. And people would probably try to resist such a process if they are really loving their autonomies. So we make an argument that under these circumstances of the cool water condition, the emerging social structure was less dominated by hierarchies and harbored more autonomies. And that also meant that social groups have been formed through agreement and became practiced in self-organization. If you think of Western medieval Europe and all the types of autonomous organizations that existed, you might think of fraternities, sororities, artisan crafts, merchant guilds, trade leagues, local assemblies, town assemblies, village assemblies. These were all autonomous organizations, or think even of the Hanseatic League, which also was a private organization and not a state organization, but very powerful. they were practiced in self-organization. And when you are practiced in self-organization, you also know how to organize resistance against over-ambitious rulers. And some of these rulers, and also in Western Europe, became over-ambitious, especially those ones who pursued an absolutist agenda, which was only temporarily successful in Western Europe. So what happened? How did the state emerge in Northwestern Europe? The feudal state actually was not a state in a proper sense. You had feudal kingdoms, and there was a hierarchy of command. Yes, the emperor was more than the king was more than the duke was more than an earl, and so on and so forth. And the lower end of the hierarchy were the farmers and the peasants. But authorities had very weak means of enforcement. Why? Because there was no civil service, there was no bureaucracy that was salaried, and there was no standing army at the disposal of the ruler. So for that matter, the feudal state actually was not really a state. A state can only emerge when rulers have monetary revenues, money, so to speak, a budget from which they can fund the two backbones of a real state, which is armies and bureaucracies. Now, that option was not on the table for the longest time in Northwestern Europe because there was no monetized economy. It was a barter economy. So there was no cash flow that a ruler could have a grip on by taxation. But as you can imagine, Western European rulers were adoring rulers more east, where we had powerful Chinese emperors or the Russian Tsar. They were admiring those guys' power concentration and mightiness. And of course, as soon as the Western European economy started to become monetized, so in the era of early pre-industrial capitalism, what happened is that actually, yes, rulers demanded taxation. The problem was they were confronted with a society where social groups were practiced in self-organization and could organize resistance. And we saw those resistances in the liberal revolutions, the French Revolution, the English Revolution, the Dutch Revolution, that threw rulers overboard, that appeared over ambitious. So state building could not be just enforced top-down in Northwestern Europe. And what happened is we entered into a very unique, historically unique process of state building in which what I call a contractual state was created. And the contractual state is characterized by the fact that the power of the executive is checked by an elected assembly, which we call parliament, or it had different names in different countries, of course, but the logic was we had elected assemblies. And then there was the principle of no taxation without representation. This is a social contract. So the state can build its fiscal, its military, its technological capacities, but in return for something, and that is that those who are taxed are represented and have an eye on what is done with the money. And that means that the state formation process is tied back to social preference aggregation, and then the state starts to work for the wider society and not for the power holders by themselves only. And that is interesting. The contractual state really stays in a stark contrast to the coercive state that prevailed everywhere else in the world where states emerged to begin with. All the pristine old civilizations, if you go from Egypt to Mesopotamia, to India, to China, all those agrarian empires were coercive states. The same is, of course, also true for Tsarist Russia. So the contractual state was a peculiarity, a singularity, so to speak, that emerged under those particular conditions of the cool water configuration. The contractual state, and I'm not calling it democracy on purpose, because in my definition, it doesn't make sense to to talk about democracy before we don't have universal suffrage. Because that's part of the definition of democracy. Of course, the contractual state did not have universal suffrage. Not all parts of the population were represented in those elected assemblies, and not all parts of the population had the franchise. Only those ones who were taxed had. But the logic that taxation comes with entitlements, namely representation, that logic embodied the seed so that the contractual state could naturally evolve into democracies. And that happened by extending taxation to general income taxation, and then we get in return a drive towards universal suffrage. So this is one line of our reasoning why we believe that the cool water condition is at the roots, the origin of those emancipatory dynamics that define the Western society's weirdness, as Schultz and Henrich call it today. Another strand of argument relates now not so much to the state, so we go a little bit lower, bottom down to the grassroots of society. When we look at the family patterns and family structures that were typical of the cool water regions, we find this nuclear family pattern where women married with consent. So consent was necessary, which is not the case in many other cultures where marriages are prearranged. Women married much later in higher ages than in other areas of the world, meaning that the woman is more close to the age of her husband, and that has implications for how self-confident and experienced those women are and are treating their husbands. So there was certainly more. There was not entire gender equality. It's still not there today, but it was closer. It was, relatively speaking, more gender equality than in other extended family contexts. More generally speaking, one could say that in the nuclear family, patriarchal gender and seniority norms are less pronounced. So there's a more of an egalitarian imprint here. Okay, now we present a bit of evidence for what I have been saying. That actually can be backed up with data. And I will walk you through a couple of the things. I made it relatively simple in visual terms. This is our figure 1 for the rejoinder, where we try to summarize the logic of our argumentation in a figure that juxtaposes two extreme conditions. One we call human impairment, which is the red end of the continuum, and the other we call human empowerment, which is the blue end of the continuum. And both configurations are characterized by making a connection between three things that are of configurational importance for any type of society. So the one is existential or material conditions. That's one of the most basic real life facts that we have in a society, whether it's rich or poor, educated, illiterate, and so on and so forth. So basic existential conditions which reflect themselves in certain prevalent mentality modes. So this is more a psychological thing. And then we get certain regime institutions becoming more likely when they are those ones that fit those mentality modes. Now we argue that the cool water environment is, so to speak, the divider, or marks the bifurcation that decides whether things go to the left or to the right. When cool water scores are low, when the cool water condition is not strong or only or absent, like in countries that are very dry and hot, you basically have the opposite of cool water conditions. What we usually then find is that we have resources, and that's, for instance, true for water itself. In the Middle East is pretty dry, and in various areas, actually deserts. And then water is a very concentrated resource because you have to go to an oasis to get to water. So then you have concentrated resources, and we know from development economics that this is creating hierarchies. And when hierarchies are dominating the social fabric, a certain mentality mode starts to kick in order to make people appease and content to live in those hierarchies, because it means that many people have to live in inferior positions and have to and are bossed around all the time. And in order to make them ready for that, the psychological climate is primarily characterized by what we call here intimidation. So you scare people so they feel threatened and give in. And then this intimidation type of mentality will feed authoritarian values. So an idolation of hierarchy, of coercion, and in the group behavior of favoritism. So what I mean here is in-group favoritism, out-group discrimination is part of the authoritarian values. And if those values are prevalent, this lends legitimacy, support to autocratic institutions. If the cool water condition is strongly pronounced, you get decentral resources. Under decentral resources, autonomies are a more prominent element in the social fabric than hierarchies. And then the predominant psychological climate is not intimidation, but encouragement. Under autonomies, people feel and are encouraged to claim their entitlements and rights of which they are convinced. You will also see this probably very strongly in education styles. Under intimidation, we will probably have a very punitive parental style, whereas under encouragement, we will probably have a very liberal parental style. Well, and if encouragement is the dominant psychological mode, emancipative values will be favored, and they emphasize choice and impartiality in the treatment of others, and in-group, out-group distinctions are no longer that important, and this constellation then lends legitimacy to democratic institutions. And then, of course, these are the end poles of a continuum. There are societies that have kind of mixed cool water conditions. Some elements are there, others are not. We would expect them then accordingly to find in some gray zone in between the extremes that we have schematized, stylized here. Now, the next plot is a box plot. The cool water index ranges from 0 to 1. You will see the Western cultural zones on the left side, the 4 that we have. And you see that the West is very unique in how strong the cool water condition is present in the West. It's hardly anywhere there that strongly. Uruguay is an outlier. And then you see that especially the English and the Germanic West, which are the Protestant parts, are even higher than the Western average. So from this you can conclude that indeed one can argue that strong cool water conditions are a signature, a defining feature of Western civilization, even more so for its Protestant branch. The next picture shows on the vertical my human empowerment index, which summarizes favorable economic conditions, especially technological progress and education. So existential conditions, emancipative values are in there, and liberal democracy or effective democracy. So the 3 components that we saw in the model before are here summarized into a single human empowerment index measured over previous times. And then we have on the horizontal the cool water condition. One can see by mere eyeballing that this is a powerful linear relationship. You will see this is not about determinism, because then every dot had to be on a straight line, on the regression line, which is not the case. So we leave still 24% of the variation unexplained. And that unexplained variation, I would argue, is the room of choice that is left to societal elites in determining whether they are at the ceiling or at the bottom of the distribution corridor. But apparently societies cannot escape the corridor entirely. You can decide whether you get to the floor or the ceiling, but you cannot leave the corridor itself, apparently. You will also see a couple of regularities. If you think about which countries are at the bottom of the distribution, so underachievers, you will see there's a lot of ex-communist countries assembled there. You see Russia is an underperformer, an underachiever, given its cool water condition in terms of human empowerment. And on the other hand, you see on the ceiling of the distribution, you see a lot of island states. Look at Barbados, Bahamas, Costa Rica. Japan is an island state. So islands obviously have some advantage that makes them favorable for human empowerment. It is actually, in political science, conventional wisdom going back to the 50s when Robert Dahl published a paper with Tufte where they talked about the gentleness of the small island states, and they referred it to a higher likelihood, holding all else equal, a higher likelihood to be a democracy if you are a small island state. Okay, so this was contemporary evidence. Here we look at an indicator that is a historic indicator of emancipatory outcomes, and it's female reproductive autonomy. It's also a compository index that measures low female fertility, late female marriage ages, low child mortality, and a lower disease prevalence. That creates a latent variable that I have standardized again in a 0 to 1 range. And this is measured in around 1800. So this is pre-industrial times for most countries except Belgium and England, of course. So this is a pre-industrial relationship. And we can conclude from that that the cool water effect probably reaches farther back in time. And this we show here. These are newer data from VDEM project in Gothenburg. They have now extended their data set back in time all the way to the year 1789 when the French Revolution started. So we now have measures here from 1789, and we see on the left-hand graph their measure of liberal democracy, and on the right-hand graph we see their measure of regime corruption. So two aspects of governance, democratic governance and honest or enlightened governance, if you like, for which corruption is an inverse indicator, of course. And you see the correlation works as it should. Cool water strongly correlates strongly negatively with unenlightened governance. It's a correlation of minus 0.72 and one of plus 7.3 with democracy and in the left-hand graph. So there's some historic evidence. Now, to get away from this here, from the pictures, we replicated all of Schultz et al.'s regression models and looked at their dependent variables. So the dependent variables you see in that correlation table, one is individualism. They took those from different surveys, including the World Value Survey and other data sources. A measure for creativity, embeddedness is Schwartz. It's the opposite of autonomy. Then they have a measure for analytic thinking, conformity, a tightness score, obedience, tradition, proper behavior, dishonesty, and so on and so forth. Blood donations and all kinds of things with which they try to cover this impersonal pro-sociality plus individualistic egalitarian orientation. So this is their set of dependent variables. And what we simply have done, we have rerun the models. So here in the next one, you see, this is country level evidence. You see the church exposure, the Western church exposure, the Eastern church exposure, and the cool water index. And we also have tables with tons of controls, of additional controls. And we run these regressions on the dependent variables that they have used. And what we simply did, we replicated all their models and changed just one condition. That is, we plugged in addition to their variables, the cool water index. Before we did that, in their models, so Schultz et al., the Western Church always turns out as a highly significant and usually the most powerful predictor of those dependent variables. Now what happens in all the models we run, if you plug in the cool water condition, what happens is that the church exposure, Western Church exposure often, not always, but often turns completely insignificant. It always drops in terms of the magnitude of its effect. So the effect becomes much smaller, and the cool water condition absorbs the impact of the Western Church exposure. In fact, this is not so surprising if you know, which we have done in a mediation model, that the cool water condition explains Western Church exposure to about 65% of the variation. So the church, and this shows to us that the real selective force behind the Western Church's particular ideological choices when it comes to marriage policies, for instance, the real selective force behind these doctrinal choices were the incentives that are embodied in a cool water condition. That's our argument. I could show you now or walk you through a ton of regression analyses. We have a huge appendix. This paper is not yet submitted. We hope to do that in about final robustness checks in about 2 months from now. That's the plan.
Okay, Chris, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for a very interesting presentation. And now I'm ready to open the floor for questions and comments.
If I could have a question.
Yeah? Yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Chris, for your presentation. Your analysis today focused mostly on the cool water condition as opposed to the Western Church. And of course, cool water condition is time invariant, so it has been for a very long time. And yet the sort of the prominence of the West and democratization in the West did not occur, 2,000 years ago, or even 1,000 years ago, although you argued that there were some independent organization, but you could also argue that there were guilds in China at that time and so on. So maybe your argument today missed a little bit this component that showed why this time invariant factor started to work especially strongly relatively recently.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could say a few words about this. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. You have asked that question already before. I have a whole chapter on that question. Now, there is 2 answers. Speaking on logical terms, a constant condition like the cool water condition kind of embodies the seed or the potential for a certain development. But for that potential to unfold, so to speak, to germinate, it needs time. So it is not surprising that it is not present in the moment humans lived there. So it needed some time to germinate. And I looked at times when, so what I did is, when did civilization, is a book by Bayroch, who writes which civilization was when at the stage when an industrial takeoff could have happened. And he argues, for instance, in China, this was the case under the Song dynasty. In India, this was the case under the Mughals. In the Middle East, this might have been much earlier the case in Iraq. And in the Roman Empire, he says around the Augustan peace, so around the year 0, the Roman Empire could have made an industrial takeoff. And he defines this stage from where it is possible as the mature agrarian stage, where we have cities and money and forms of capitalism and bureaucracies and also certain technologies, and it developed trade and commerce. Then it could happen. Northwestern Europe, also much later than Southern Europe, reached that stage relatively late in its history. I would say not before 1400 and maybe later. There was also the Black Death 100 years before, and a demographic disaster. So this is one thing. But if you measure, when you calculate, okay, let's say the West reached this pre-industrial stage and say 1450, it only needed 300 years to make the Industrial Revolution. Other civilizations reached that stage much earlier, some even millennia earlier, and did not jump. And I argue this has something to do with the cool water condition. Now, why was the West late in that thing? This is an interesting, ironic or paradoxical part of the story, because we argue, and I think we can show, that the cool water condition was a decelerator for the first revolution, that is the Neolithic Revolution. So jumping from hunter-gatherer into agriculture was very much delayed among populations in cool water areas, and some of them out of Eurasia. When you think of North America, the Hurons or the Iroquois, they didn't even invent agriculture to begin with, and it came there only with European settlement. And those kinds of things. And then you have, of course, why is a cool water condition a decelerator for the first revolution, but an accelerator for the later revolution, the industrial one? I have talked about this, but not about the first component. And part of the story is migratory distance. If you look at where the geography of the cool water areas, where they're located relative to the human origin, those were areas that were later populated by modern Homo sapiens humans. So because of the migratory distance, later be peopling, so to speak, of those areas. And then I make the argument that cool water areas are usually boreal, so woodlands that are, and also relatively close to the coast, that offer for a hunter-gatherer style of life a pretty lush conditions, that this lifestyle can be followed in relatively small groups in a relatively autonomous way. And if we look today in what anthropologists say, whether the transition to agriculture was always a thing that people would like to do, so to speak, voluntarily. If you compare the freer lifestyle of a hunter-gatherer with the very rigid and disciplined lifestyle of a farmer, people probably wouldn't do it voluntarily unless they are forced by population pressures from outside or by some climatic disaster or whatever. So we have good reasons to believe that in cool water areas, people would hesitate to make the transition, and they only do it when the diffusion of agriculture reaches them, and then they have no more choice because you are outnumbered by the much more denser agrarian populations if you refuse to make the transition yourself. And therefore, a later transition to agriculture.
Thank you. And I also have a second question, if I may. So you explained that the cool water condition has two aspects, the temperature aspect and the humidity or the water aspect. And with water aspect, it is very clear that if there's a shortage of water, then it is easier to control by the ruling elite. And this facilitates the establishment of tyrannical state and so on. But with the temperature aspect, it is not so clear. For instance, I'm thinking about southern China. As opposed to northern China, there is a problem of water, but in southern China, there is no problem of water at all. So there's plenty of water in south of the Yangtze River. There are many large and small rivers, and humidity is high, rain is constant, but of course it is warm. It is much warmer than in northwestern Europe. Mm-hmm. So how is it that the warmer climate, even in the presence of abundant water, facilitates authoritarian state? That part of the argument is not very clear. Thank you.
You probably know the papers of Thomas Thalheim, who worked on this difference or boundary in China. There is this rice-wheat theory, right? So the northern part had wheat agriculture and the southern part had rice agriculture, and the southerners are more collectivistic in their orientations and the northerners are more individualistic in their orientations. Maybe the potential that the more cool water prone northeast of China would have, so closer to the border of the Korean peninsula, could not unfold because the power center was never there of the empire. The power center was in a not cool water region, and that imposes itself on the rest of the country. I mean, the temperature component is we had so much evidence in the literature. They did actually, my associates did kind of a meta study, a literature review, and there is so much evidence that soil productivity is better when it's colder, that work productivity is higher when it's colder. So the relationship, therefore I did not talk about that so much, because the relationship between temperature and development and productivity in particular is very well established. So I did not comment on that too much for that reason.
Okay, that argument, yes, of course, I'm aware of it, and I think there is, you know, a lot of truth about it. It makes sense, but on the other hand, the whole agriculture of Japan is the rice agriculture. And so, but nevertheless, maybe Japan was better off because, as you also said in your presentation, is an island state as opposed to southern China, where, you know, the centralized control was geographically easier because of the terrain as opposed to Japan. Well, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I can comment to the Japan factor. Japan is very interesting because it has a modest cool water condition according to how we created the index. So it's not so high up there where the West is, but it looks much better than other areas in Asia or even in the Middle East or in Africa. So it has some cool water features. For instance, it has steady rain. On the other hand, it has a very rugged terrain, and there is not so much arable land because of that. And it also has, comes rarely together, but in Japan it does. Normally, continuous rain prevents collective irrigation work. But if you have rice cultivation, you have collective irrigation work in order to maintain the terraces. And rice is also very labor intense, which is not true for wheat and rye and livestock farming, which were the predominant forms of farming in Northwestern Europe. And we believe that the labor intensity of the crops that we find to be prevalent in a given agriculture has effects on or it creates different fertility pressures. When labor intensity is very high, fertility pressures are high to sustain a cheap mass workforce. Whereas in Europe, a small family farm could work a quite sizable area when we talk about rye or wheat, and even livestock farming consumes even more area, but less labor. And so the productivity factor ratio, if you think of land to labor ratio, was also influenced, I think, by these climatic factors.
Thank you.
I have a question. As far as I remember, in earlier iterations of your cool water argument, you also pointed out that cool water condition is associated with a relatively lower pathogens load. And today you didn't say what about it, and can you comment on that? Yeah. Did you elaborate further on this part of the puzzle?
Empirically, we have this, we can show this, and I do it in the book, using the data that first by Thornhill and Fincher, and then by Marian Schaller, who has published the data in JCCP. And there is a very strong correlation to the effect that pathogen load, as it is measured by them, is significantly lower and gets lower and lower the more you go into cool water areas. And you would also see that reflected in a lower infant mortality. So we have this in our data, we have the evidence. I'm just no longer, I'm not emphasizing this so much anymore, because recently I had some doubts about the data quality of those pathogen disease data from historic times. I have some doubts that they might not be really so accurate as the authors claim they are.
Okay, but I got your point on the empirical level, but I mean on the substantial level. So we know that there were quite many epidemics in Europe in ancient times, in Middle Ages, even in the modern time. So how can we compare this experience of Northwestern Europe or Europe as a whole with other parts of the world? So we just assume that the level of epidemics, mortality rates due to infections is significantly lower, or like any other argument?
The argument would go like, okay, I mean, we talk about disease prevalence in relative terms, because what these authors measure, I think Jeffrey Sachs has done the same. They go through a list of diseases, or they list all the diseases that are known to be communicable among humans. And then you will realize that the list, there is everywhere a list. So there is no a territory where there is no disease on the list. But the length of the list varies considerably, and there is a very clear lucky latitude thing. Even though it might sound counterintuitive, you would think in colder climates people get earlier a cold and is a higher risk to get sick. But in fact, we don't have dengue fever, yellow fever, malaria, and a whole list of other things that are very prevalent in the tropics. And yes, we had the Black Death, which killed 50%, even higher in some stretches of land of the population. And here comes another argument in that comes from Eric Jones. He argued that the disaster pattern differed between Europe and Asia. So he made a point that disaster in Asia, if you think of droughts or cyclones or super heavy monsoon, had a tendency to destroy infrastructure, but not so much to kill people, where the European disaster pattern, well, it's very much related to the Black Death and the plague, killed people much more than infrastructure. And that again influences the land to labor ratio and makes the human factor even more scarce. And then, of course, also economically valuable. And some people have argued that the philosophy of humanism, which infused more individualism and value on the individual, emphasis on the value of the individual human being, was created by the increase of the economic value of labor through the scarcity that came after the Black Death. I don't know. These are at least arguments that are around, and there's some evidence to back that up with data. I just have some doubts about the quality of the data.
Okay, thanks. Questions?
I think I have a question.
Okay, Maria.
Is it possible?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Because I'm not so familiar with Zoom, so I'm not sure that you can see me. So, Chris, you said that it is important. There are two things which are important. The first one is the rainfall, and the second one is the temperature. But I thought perhaps it is also important that in cool water condition, there is a small difference between the summer and winter. Perhaps the climate is more stable, and this stability is stimulates education and democratization and so on.
Yeah. There's two things to that. So there's a couple of papers who have shown that seasonality is conducive to development, economic development, because the argument goes, when you have seasonality, you must plan, for instance, for food storage over winter and other things. So there's more planning involved, and that will shape people's psychology in such a manner that long-term thinking of investments that have a delayed gratification, as we used to say, that is more firmly implanted in people's thinking. That would also open people more to the idea of savings, and also for such an investment that really has a delay of gratification, which is education. And for all these reasons, seasonality is said to be conducive to economic development and to productivity. I have looked into the data and how far this is really true, because the one thing is seasonality is strongly attached to latitude, seasonality in temperature, not in precipitation. So the farther we go away, at the equator, we actually don't have really seasonality in temperatures. So the temperatures are pretty much the same throughout. There are no seasons to begin with in equatorial climates, at least not seasons in the sense that temperature vary a lot in their daily peaks between winter and summer. Day length doesn't vary. So you get seasonality automatically as you go north or south from the equator. So seasonality will increase inevitably. But then in higher latitudes, the seasonality patterns fall in two parts. We have continental climates like in Russia, where the highest seasonality we have actually in Mongolia, where summer heat can be very extreme, as much as winter cold. And that is an excess seasonality that is apparently not helpful for development, but only that part of the seasonality that is attached or incorporated in its covariation with latitude. Because the other part, of course, are maritime climates in colder regions, closer to the coast. There, the seasonality will be lower than in the continental climates, and you will avoid very hot summers, especially. Continental climates, so to speak, have one thermal challenge, which is winter cold, that tends to be productive, but it has another thermal challenge, and that is summer heat. That is an unproductive challenge, because in summer heat, you do not want to work. It's disincentivizing, unless you have air conditioning and modern technology. There's also a reason why the prevalence of slavery correlates with tropical climates where Europeans did not want to work, but extract the produce and the resources. They just forced people into labor through slavery. And it's probably also no coincidence that in the United States, the South was the part who defended the institution of slavery in the Civil War, and the North had abolished it much earlier, or didn't have it actually. Yeah, so much to seasonality. It's a relatively complex story.
I see a raised hand by Ekaterina Nastina.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. It was a very interesting talk, and I went to the web page that was mentioned on the first slide, and I got a question. So as I can see in data and maps, you have the data for cool water index for NUTS regions, and I was just interested. Do you see the same strong effect as we've seen for the regressions for countries for regions? So is it the same, given that they must have influenced also some common non-ecological country level factors that might have influenced all the variables of interest?
Mm-hmm. We find we can replicate the effects that we find at the country level, also the significance levels, especially if we keep the sample pooled. When we run, for instance, a three-level model, where we could, or what we did in one regression analysis was, for instance, we look at emancipative values at the individual level as a dependent variable, and then introduce other individual level characteristics like education, age, and the usual suspects. And then we introduce on level 2 NUTS regional variables, including the region cool water condition. And on the third level, we introduce certain country level characteristics. So if we do that, usually the country level absorbs most of the explanatory power that regional variables had before we introduced country level, or before we modeled country level variation. And that is for a simple reason. We have 320 NUTS 2 regions distributed over 25, 28 countries. And if you look at how much of the cross-regional variability in cool water conditions is due to the between component, so between countries rather than within countries, you figure out very quickly that 85% of the total variation in cool water conditions is between countries, and only 15% is within countries, which is in it by itself interesting, because it shows us that obviously political spaces have been evolved shaped in such a manner that they are thermohydrologically speaking more homogeneous. And this is something that has actually not pointed out by anyone so far.
Thank you very much. I'm just thinking, well, I first started thinking about Russia, which I'm not sure if fits this definition, but probably depends on how you measure it.
Russia belongs to the countries which show a relatively sizable cross-regional variation. And you generally would think that bigger countries or country area size, territorial area size of a country is a very powerful explanatory factor here. And it looks like it when you just run a bivariate correlation, and you will find a positive correlation between how large is country area size and how much variation is there in the countries, so within regional, across regional variation in the countries in terms of cool water conditions. However, it turns out that in fact there's other influences that are much more important to create a high variation in cool water conditions within countries, because the leaders within country variation, you would probably not guess that the leaders are Ethiopia, Kenya, Peru, and Chile. And then these are not all of those are huge countries compared to the US or Russia or China. And it's interesting to see because obviously what creates within country variation in CV conditions is, in CW conditions is elevation. So a lot of change in terrain, elevation, so altitude, and north-south extension, as you have it in Chile, because countries with a large or larger north-south than east-west extension stretch over more diverse climate zones, and therefore you will have more variability in cool water conditions.
Okay. Questions, comments? The last call. Well, okay, it seems that we don't have any further questions. And I'd like to thank Chris for his talk. So it was a pleasure to see you and discuss your paper. I hope to see you not only online, but offline as well. Hopefully someday this mess will be over. And okay, thank you.
Thank you, guys.